Hey everyone, thanks for coming out and welcome to the course. This is SGS 301, Principles of Global Studies, and this course is designed to really set up your course of study in global studies more broadly and to provide you an introduction to what the study of globalization is all about. So to get us started with today, I'm going to talk a little bit about globalization and specifically my own ways of approaching this topic, because as you can kind of guess, it's a big topic, the world's a big place and all of that. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I tend to approach this, a few different perspectives on globalization that are going to be useful to us going forward in this course, and then a little bit about the course's requirements and what you're going to be doing for the next 7.5 weeks or so. So, to start off with what I guess is the big question, what is globalization? Well, here's my short answer, and this is an answer we can obviously keep developing as time goes on in this course. Since about 1972 or so, there has been a sea change in how people experience the world around them. Partly this is the stuff you already know because it's in the news a lot, how people make a living, the kinds of wages we earn, and so on and so forth. But a lot of it is stuff that happens under the surface, so to speak. How people identify politically, pursue economic development, watch sports, have actually changed quite radically in the course of the last 45 to 50 years thereabout. In this context, telling stories about states, which is the classic way we talk about global politics, culture, and society, doesn't necessarily get us very far. And one of the emerging ideas in the study of globalization is that breaking down the world only into a group of states or a group of countries, it can be useful, but it can also be very limiting. So, students of global studies see economics, politics, and culture as well global phenomena, and the planet as a whole becomes the field of study. This does not mean, because we're going to be talking a lot about this idea as we go forward, this does not mean, obviously, that the world shares one global culture and it's the same everywhere, or that economic conditions are identical in every part of the world, because obviously these aren't true. What it does mean, and it does suggest, is that there are certain global commonalities to the way that economic processes of development are organized, to the way that ideas about politics and political representation function, and even to cultural norms and to shared ideas of what culture means, that are increasingly global and that are meaningful at a global scale. Well, this gets pretty abstract pretty quickly, so what I'd like to do in the next section of this lecture is offer you a few different examples of what I'm talking about, and we can of course go from there. So let's start off with economic processes. This is one of the big processes of global change that we're going to be studying in this course. The classic way of looking at economic development is to look at, well, the difference between rich countries and poor countries. Once upon a time, going back to 1955, this meant talking about first and second and third worlds. More recently, people talk about developing, underdeveloped countries, and the World Bank these days breaks it down by income bracket, and you can find lots of details and lots of data in their annual World Development Indicators reports. And this is not foolish or silly or anything like that. But if we dig a little bit deeper into the data, a bit of a different picture emerges. What we're going to see in our section on economic processes of global change is the ways in which you have these concentrations of economic activities, even within rich and increasingly developed countries, that are very geographically localized. This is the Lights On, Lights Out project that was published in National Geographic magazine in 2017, which gives you a bit of an indication of this. And if we look a little bit more closely at the regional picture, in the case of Europe, in the case of West Africa, in the case of Europe and in the case of West Africa, sorry, I went ahead a little bit too quickly on the slide there, you see these really distinctive concentrations of electrical activity that unsurprisingly correspond to economic activity. In the case of Paris, France, since I lived there for a few years, I can talk a little bit more about it. Well, the average francilien, as they say, the average resident of Paris or the outlying suburbs, earns €1 29 for every euro earned by somebody in the rest of the country. In other words, the economic activity is concentrated not in the country as a whole, but in this particular area. And we can do something similar with Spain in the case of Madrid and Barcelona. In the UK, where London has become almost a country unto itself in some ways, concentrating this vast amount of economic activity in this one area of the UK, with of course a few little highlights here and then around Glasgow, for example, in Scotland and so forth, and in a number of other places as well. Likewise, West Africa is less a region than a whole series of regions, with a whole concentration of economic activities along coastal areas of Nigeria, Cameroon, Gabon, and a series of other West African countries, and a much less economically active hinterland. What this suggests is that in a lot of ways, it's these spots in the world that we ought to be talking about, and it's the relationship between these spots and other areas that is really at stake when we talk about economic globalization. Talking about Nigeria or Cameroon or France as a whole becomes not irrelevant, but a little bit less important. The slide I accidentally went to a little bit too quickly is an older visualization of the same thing, basically showing the intensity of economic activities in core areas, in this case of Europe. But the people who put together these data visualizations did it for the world as a whole, and really giving us a working idea of what it means to have these poles of economic concentration at a global scale. And in fact, sort of developing this theme a little bit further, the World Bank has abolished the term developing countries. They did this just in 2016 because the difference between Malawi and Malaysia is greater than the difference between Malaysia and the US. So how could you possibly create a definition of developing countries that encompassed these two very, very different places? And increasingly, research is trying to focus less on this idea of developing countries as a whole and more on income stratification, income inequalities within countries, within regions, within cities. And these are all issues we're going to start to touch upon and talk about in this class. When we talk about states and state-led processes of globalization, well, if you've ever taken an international relations class, you'll know there's a standard way for talking about the state in global politics. It focuses on ideas of the national interest, it focuses on concepts of survival and the ability to function in a world of states, and so on and so forth. And that's not irrelevant again, but again, there are other ways of looking at this. One, obviously states are framed and bracketed in these alliances, NATO, the United Nations, and a whole series of others as well. But two, many states aren't quite all that, so to speak. They might look very nice and color-coded and like they have clear, bright boundaries on a map, but in reality, they have all kinds of real difficulties and problems in exerting authority over their territory. On the one hand, this goes to the questions of disputed areas, in this case of Kashmir between India and Pakistan. But on the other hand, even so-called developed countries have a very hard time providing public goods, things like healthcare and education, consistently and evenly across a national territory. Highly developed countries, the UK and other countries in the European Union, or in the UK's case, I guess formerly in the European Union, have been struggling with many of these questions of how to actually properly incorporate and provide public goods to people inside even a rich, developed country. And I know, for example, where I grew up in Canada, this was an ongoing question because you travel from one side of the country to another, and just in terms of the kinds of services available, the infrastructure that's available, you really don't always have the impression you're in the same country. So these are some of the issues we're going to be talking about as well. But the other thing, too, is that states are increasingly tied to human rights and to other sorts of global and transnational campaigns that don't literally limit them at the point of a gun. Nobody points a gun at you and forces you to respect international human rights law. but that limit in all kinds of complicated ways what they can do and how they can do it. 100 years ago or so, human rights was a peripheral issue. It was something for bearded hippies who ate granola to be concerned about while the quote-unquote men of state planned wars and conquests. Well, obviously, we don't live in that world anymore, and in the world that we do live in, human rights are an ongoing issue that binds states, but also NGOs, journalists, and policy experts together in all kinds of complex ways. In this course, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this, in particular around the issues of FGM, or female genital mutilation, female genital cutting. You have a few different articles on this in your course reader. But more generally speaking, we're going to look at the way in which states react to, respond to, sometimes try to lead human rights campaigns, and the complexities of those efforts. Well, talking about human rights actually gets us into global culture as well. And by culture, what I have in mind here is not, narrowly speaking, a single cultural way of life, because obviously there are a great many of those throughout the world. They change, they evolve, and so on and so forth. But what I have in mind are the broad norms and languages that people engage with on a global scale. So, obviously, there are many religions in the world and many sects and many divisions within those religions, but we can speak fairly coherently, I think, about the idea of global faith, or alternately global secularism. Likewise, of global media. Not because these things are the same everywhere, but because there is a form of consciousness, and I would say a language, that is increasingly globalized and that binds and connects people, even if they disagree with, for example, an idea like human rights, they still know how to speak the language of human rights. And as time allows, we'll also talk about the ways in which places have become global markers and global symbols. So to pick the middle image on the slide that I have over here, now, looking at this, you'll probably think, well, this is just a beach, right? It's somewhere, it could be almost anywhere. But if you've ever heard this song, you'll know that this is the beach at Ipanema, Brazil. And of course, it was made into a global place through Frank Sinatra's iteration of the song, The Girl from Ipanema. But Ipanema is one kind of global place, in other words, a place that transcends the boundaries of where it is physically located, to really stand in for these broader processes of globalization and global change. Here, I'll stop the music at this stage. But the tunnel under the Bosphorus, linking two different parts of Turkey, the World War II memorial in Hiroshima, the concentration camps that are preserved in Auschwitz, for example, are all examples of global places where the significance and the salience of the place is not just about where they are, but what they mean to a global audience. And this is another one of these issues in global culture, which I think is really important and really valuable. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about these three processes of globalization: global economic change, global states, and global culture. We're obviously not going to get to do a great amount in 7.5 weeks, but we'll do our best to cover a lot of different issues and a lot of different problems and have some really interesting conversations. In terms of how this course is structured, you have a few core requirements I'm going to outline here, and I'm going to ask you, of course, to reference the syllabus for the final breakdown of the requirements, the final division of points, and so on and so forth. But the core requirements are as follows. On the one hand, you have a midterm exam. It will involve writing answers to questions and demonstrating your knowledge of the lectures and the course readings. I'll specify the requirements and how it works well in advance of the deadline for the exam. Second, you are going to be blogging in this class, and you're going to be writing ongoing blog posts. Basically, in the first week, what I want you to do is pick a region of the world that you're either interested in or you want to know more about, and so on and so forth. Then, for every weekly unit, you are basically going to blog a short essay in the neighborhood of 500 to 600 words that ties together some independent media research that you've done on the problems and the issues in your region of the world, together with what we're studying in that week's unit. So, for example, in the week where we're talking about human rights, if your region is East Asia, well, there are lots of debates going on about respect or non-respect for human rights in East Asian countries. There are lots of discussions and issues. It should be fairly straightforward to pull a few different sources together and develop a blog post that talks about those issues while connecting them back to the class. This is something you're going to be doing on a weekly basis, and so I'm going to be encouraging you very early on in this class to get a really good newspaper subscription, and the New York Times happily is free with your ASU account, and to develop a list of other media sources that cover your region of the world. So in the case of East Asia, there are a number of English language international newspapers that are quite readily available online that cover East Asia extensively. In the case of Europe, you have sources like The Guardian, The Times of London, and a whole series of others. In addition to more international news sources like the New York Times, The Economist magazine, and so on. So this is going to be a core part of the course. It's going to represent a lot of points in the course overall. Third, you're going to make an academic poster. This sounds terribly intimidating, but trust me, it's a lot of fun. Basically, this is a tool I use to help people get away from the reliance on PowerPoints to express their projects and to adopt a more visual and concentrated way of expressing what you know about the world. You're going to develop an academic poster that focuses on A, your region, and B, a specific problem or issue in it. So, for example, human rights in the Philippines could be the starting point for a really great academic poster. And you are going to post to Blackboard at the end of the semester a short online presentation where you present your poster to the class. Neither of these is technically really hard. I'm going to have tutorials for how to design an academic poster that'll really simplify the process. And ASU has really good instructions, if you've never done this before, for linking a YouTube video into Blackboard so everybody can see it really straightforwardly. The research, of course, the research requirements and the work involved is something else, because there's a fair amount of work. But then that's the whole point, and you get to learn something from it. And even more importantly, you wind up with this really cool poster that you can show people subsequently as evidence of the work that you've done. Never hesitate throughout this course to get in touch with me if you have any questions, concerns, or just want to talk more about global studies, political science, grad school. This is what faculty are there for. And we're always happy to talk to you about anything broadly relevant to the class, to the major, and ways in which we can help you achieve your goals. Last but not least, get all work in on time. And I know I say this in the syllabus, but I'm going to reiterate it here. Folks, trust me, it is really, really difficult to keep track of what's going on in the course if people are writing in saying, oh my god, I can't get this work in today, I have to get it in tomorrow, and so on and so forth. I've elaborated a set of really clear penalties on the syllabus, as well as a few cases in which it would be justified to hand in work late. Otherwise, though, this is really a course that rewards steady work as opposed to one that rewards cramming. So I'm going to encourage you all to just work really steadily, and even if the work isn't always the best you can do in the time that you have, to work and at getting in your work on time in a really timely way. I can grade it more quickly, you can get feedback on it more quickly, and we can all work from there as a class. Thanks very much, and I look forward to working with you all this semester.